Talk lines are open now at 866-455-9797. This is The Dana Show.
DanaRadio.com. You can also find me on Twitter at Loesch. We were discussing last week how it seemed all of a sudden the ATF has changed their form, their 4473s. It's the record that you are required to fill out if you're purchasing a gun, if you're selling a gun, to identify who you are, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems as though now they've changed it to ask about not just race, ethnicity, which, poses the question, why would that even matter in purchasing a firearm? Joining me right now, I wasn't the only one that had that question. Senator Roy Blunt, the great state of Missouri, is asking for questions on this because he's just as curious as the rest of us are as to why this changed, how it changed, and what changed it. I thought it had to at least be something legislatively done. Good afternoon to you, Senator.
Well, good afternoon, Dana. Good to be with you. It does seem to me that the current administration is doing everything they can to return to focusing on race instead of moving away from focusing on race is one of the things we think about when we think about our fellow Americans. And I just don't see any reason on this form at all why those questions need to be asked. The questions essentially are, first of all, are you Hispanic or Latino? And then after your answer is yes or no to that, then you answer another set of questions about which group you think you fall into racially and ethnically. And I just don't see why that has any purpose. Maybe on the census we do every 10 years, even possibly on some government programs to see who is participating in programs that the government funds. But this is a constitutional right. It's like we used to ask this question on voter registration forms, but I don't think any state has asked that question for about a decade and a half now for exactly the same reason. This is a right. It's something that it doesn't really matter what your race or ethnicity is in any way, and there's no particular reason to have that in a file anywhere, which is one of the questions I'm asking the ATF. Why do you ask this? Do you ever use it to put a different calculation into how quickly you process that form? And then what do you do with the information after that? And do you have the kind of security of that information that you would want to have?
Right, exactly. Well, and it just seems odd because the ATF hasn't answered really any questions on it. I know that they've been asked, but they've declined to answer as to why this change, why suddenly the need to identify individuals in such a fashion. They know so much. It amazes me, Senator, because it would be amazing if they were to ask the moderate Syrian rebels that they want to arm in terms of battling ISIS, the same questions that they asked American citizens in terms of purchasing a firearm.
Much to my surprise in terms of what it normally takes to get an answer back from the administration, we did get a letter today on this, but the letter, it looks like to me, it's full of contradictions in the letter. It says, well, we've been asking this question one way or another since 1968. And frankly, Dana, we ask a lot of questions in the United States in 1968 that we shouldn't have been asking in 1968. And then they say we do away with all of the forms unless the application is rejected, unless somehow the person doesn't have the background check. And then they say, but we actually leave the form with the local firearm licensee, which I'm going to try to figure out who that is. Does that mean these are left in the local sheriff's office, or who is it that you're thinking needs to know the race and ethnicity of people who've exercised their Second Amendment rights? And so actually their answer, which better than usual from this administration, we did get an answer, but their answer, it looks like to me, just opens them up to a lot more questions, and even the letter itself seems to contradict itself in the letter as usual. Not very good when asked why you're doing what you're doing that affects people's rights to, in this case, to have a firearm, or in other cases, their right to register to vote. There are just places where there's no reason for the government to be asking these kinds of questions.
And it's very interesting that you say you don't know, who's going to be accessing this form. Well, the 4473s, that's supposed to be, from what I understand, it's supposed to be kept, the retailer, the individual, the FFL selling it, it's supposed to be kept in their possession at all times. And ATF agents can only look at the forms during a criminal investigation or if they're auditing that dealer. So it sort of asks the question whether or not a law is being broken there, because who's accessing it?
That's right. Who's accessing it? Why do you think you need to know? Is this the best way to figure out which John Smith you're talking about, or if you really need to know that? So we're going to look very closely at this form, who's requiring it, why. You'd go back to 1968 as a justification. Again, a lot of things that the country and the government did, and particularly state governments did in 1968, that nobody does any longer. But we seem to be going down this path a little further all the time of trying to talk about how Americans are different than how Americans are the same. And I frankly think that's not the direction that the American people want to see the country head in.
Absolutely. Well, and the American people definitely don't like to see where the administration is taking the country in terms of foreign policy. A lot of discussion. We went to bed the other evening thinking we were going to go and rain rockets down and missiles down upon ISIS. And then it seems as though we took a pit stop on the way and we went after the Khorasan group, which I'm sure, all terrorist groups to me are all barbaric. But suddenly, ISIS didn't seem to be the most immediate threat. The Khorasan group was, and the president's personally signing off on every single target. What do you make of the president's leadership in handling this objective in Syria?
Well, I think the fact that the president only has the Syrian authority to help create a ground force that might be helpful to us in Syria up through the early December is a good thing, because one of the things that the Congress needs to measure and the country needs to measure is the president really have the resolve and the strategy to successfully accomplish what needs to be accomplished there. I mean, every speech that the president gives on this seems to me to trail into areas that actually divert attention from the certain trumpet that you would be sounding if really we were committed to get this truly dangerous ISIS group, this genocidal group, on the doorsteps of Europe. But if you're on the doorsteps of visa waiver countries with people from those countries fighting alongside these terrorists, you're one plane ticket away from the United States. I think they're absolutely dangerous, but that first speech is sort of delusional to start with. All the things that, how we solved these problems in Somalia and Yemen, and at some point we pushed back the Russians. I'm sure that was news to the Russians. It was news to me that we pushed back the Russians. And then he talks about Ebola and job creation. And it's just like the willingness to focus here, the resolve to focus on this issue. And even today, talking about whether the Israelis are committed to, if they've given up on the peace process, what does that possibly add to this speech, trying to convince the world that we need to be focused on one thing right now, which is this genocidal terrorist group that has a view of the world that is unacceptable.
Right. And you had mentioned as well, they could be one plane right away. I thought there would at least be some common ground in the Senate between Republicans and Democrats that, can we at least revoke the U.S. passports of those Americans that we know had joined up with terror groups that went and joined to go and wage jihad with ISIS? Could we at least maybe revoke their passports? Democrats, they pushed back on that. Did that surprise you?
Well, I wasn't real surprised, because that's the way the Senate works right now. Harry Reid has got the Senate in such a place that every single person in the Senate can object, and the only way to get anything done is unanimous consent, which means that nothing gets done. Sometimes there are things that conservatives object to, and that's generally something that I would have great sympathy for. But this is a case where Senator Cruz has a bill that I co-sponsored that would certainly look at those 100 to 200 Americans that Secretary of Defense Hagel says he believes to be fighting alongside ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and for those people that we could identify, take away their passport and take further action against them as acting in a treasonous way against the country. I think that's what we absolutely should do. The real problem beyond that, though, is the people there that we don't know who they are, and they still have that passport in their hand. But you're right. One of the Democrat senators objected when Senator Cruz tried to bring the bill that he and I have sponsored up on that last legislative day of the session. And so, again, we don't move forward and at least do the basic thing we could do is if we can identify somebody who we shouldn't be letting come back into the United States, let's take away their hall pass, which in this case is their American passport.
Yeah, you mentioned something so basic. You proposed a bill called Enforce the Law Act, which it's a shame that we have to remind the White House, that we have to remind the president that you have to work within certain confines. Your act that you would propose would ensure that the president actually upholds constitutional responsibility to faithfully execute the law. And this was done as partly reaction to the EPA and their overreach. What is the progress on that legislation? I know it passed through the House, but again, we come into the Senate and it's gridlock.
Well, again, and it's the same problem, and this is not bipartisan gridlock. This is gridlock because no bill is allowed to come to the floor with almost no exceptions to that rule. There's virtually no bill that can come to the floor that we're allowed to amend and debate, and that means no bill comes to the floor. Of the 300 plus, and there may be 350 plus bills on Harry Reid's desk that the House has passed, that if you would just bring them to the floor. My guess is 200 plus of those bills would get 60 Senate votes and would already be the law of the land on the economy, on job creation, on energy, and possibly this bipartisan vote in the House on the bill I introduced in the Senate, the Enforce the Law Act, would be one of those bills. But we've got to have tools to not just leave it up to every American to have to come up with their own money to protest a rule that has somehow damaged them, and we saw enough citizens do that a handful of overreaches by the federal government were reversed by the Supreme Court in this last session. In fact, a couple of those votes were 9-0. So even the two people that Barack Obama nominated for the court ruled with the majority that this is an administration that's out beyond where the law is, and so the Enforce Act would let the members of Congress do what now only private citizens with their own money can do, and that would be to go to court early and say, let's not have two years of litigation and trying to comply with a rule on something like the Water Act, the waters of the act that's been proposed, where the EPA would like to contend that navigable waters, the jurisdiction given in the Clean Water Act, navigable waters somehow is any water that could flow into any water, that could flow into any water, that could eventually be in a navigable stream. I think every member of Congress in the 1970s when that Clean Water Act passed, or in the 1880s when that same language began to be used in federal law, all knew what navigable meant. I believe the courts would too, but apparently President Obama and the head of the EPA, Gina McCarthy, don't have any idea what navigable means.
No, absolutely not. Well, I'm glad that you do, and I would love to see a change in the balance of power for the Senate coming up, so that laws like this, that legislation like this, could be passed. Senator Roy Blunt, we appreciate your time with us today. Thanks so much.
Hey, great to talk to you. Thanks for continuing to call attention to the Constitution and these issues that matter.
Absolutely. Thanks so much again, sir. We'll talk again soon.